we are recording this, so a recording will be sent out at some stage, I hope, next week, all things being considered. So thanks all for attending the meeting today. The presentation around circular economy creative industries is going to be delivered by myself, Martin Charter, and my colleague Trevor. Next slide, please. And we're really going to have a small welcome. And yes, we've both seen it, Trevor.
Yes.
We are a bit ahead of ourselves now. So we do have short presentations here around a welcome introduction and the context, and then the presentation of the key findings, and then some sector level implications and reflections. And then there's an opportunity for Q&A. So next slide, please. So I should sort of mention perhaps that, and maybe Trevor, you just give a sort of quick byline as well, that the Centre for Sustainable Design was set up in 1995. So we've been around in this space for a long time. We look at, and we are based at University for the Creative Arts, which is the second, at least the leadership say, the second largest provider of graduates to creative industries in Europe. So we've been engaged in a lot of activities around so-called eco-design, sustainable design, but increasingly on areas around circular economy, circular design. I did a book on this, and I also head up circular economy for British Standards Institute. So I'm heavily engaged with this, as well as leading a number of other activities around repair, reuse, and design. So we're sort of pretty heavily involved in this. But we found very little specifically looking at the creative industries as a whole. And that's why we've engaged with Trevor to really work with us on this. So maybe over to you for a couple of minutes, Trevor.
Yeah, sure. So originally a material scientist, so very interested in this particular area. Worked for around about 30 years for IBM as a distinguished engineer with big brands and their creative partners. And then for the last 5 years, really working with Martin to explore the creative industries and sustainability, leading to this latest report, which is about the circular economy. And just to echo what Martin said, it's very clear that the whole sector is really just waking up to the circular economy.
Great, thanks, Trevor. So really the aims of the presentation today is to review the findings of the analysis that Trevor's undertaken, looking at the 70 plus national circular economy strategies that are now in place at a national level, at a governmental level, where creative industries are recognized. Also explore how creative industries have been engaging in so-called 12R strategies. There are other R's strategies available, but we chose to use the 12Rs, and really to review a number of other sort of practical issues around circularity in the different parts of the creative industries. So if we move to the next slide, that would be great. So particularly this is what we see in various places, particularly in the global south. And actually I saw something not quite like this, but my recent trip to Bengaluru, I saw some challenges that look similar to me, and I think we were talking to a colleague earlier about some of the issues there. So a lot of issues about what waste being increasingly happening in different parts of the sector, notably fashion, textiles and clothing, the issues in terms of transboundary sort of exportation to different countries, and and many of those issues with the end of life or end of first life. Next slide, please. So we use sort of in our work, we use the Sustainable Development Goals as a sort of as a framework for this. Circular economy touches on a number of these different SDGs, notably 12, responsible consumption and production, but also a number of the other SDGs. Next slide, please. And we have identified, the connections relate to the SDGs in a number of the different creative industry sectors, and we've tended to use, the UK definition of the creative industries. There's about 10 segments, but for the purposes of our work, we've excluded a couple of sectors. So the SDGs do touch on a number of the segments of the creative industries. And next slide, please. We've highlighted here, some of the relevance of those SDGs to different parts of the creative industries. I won't dwell on these. If you're interested in more detail in terms of reading through these aspects, you'll have the video and you can sort of pause it at this point. What we found when we were looking more generically at sustainability and the creative industries, as a whole, is that a lot of the work has done more on the social side, but also some emerging work around climate change. But then when we get to the issues around circular economy, outside of design, outside of fashion, then the work is much less developed. Next slide, please. So we're using the classical circular economy model, originally based on which often gets forgotten, on the original model developed by McDonough Browngard that was picked up by the Elaine MacArthur Foundation, that separates out biological materials and technical materials. The reality of this, however, for many products, is that they're often mixed materials. And we were talking about some of the challenges that before we started. So you might find, mixed materials and clothing, that you've got some a polymer maybe and a cotton maybe, for example. The challenge is if you're mixing the materials, that you're, as somebody called it, designing for the dump. So the issue is if you're mixing materials, or designing for death, I even heard. So, the issue is increasingly how you design to separate out those materials, or else, the challenge is, you're not, increasing the value of materials over time. So next slide, please. So there are standards out there, and they're increasingly growing. So there was a British standard, which was the first in the world, that I was part of the development team there. Look at how you integrate circularity into businesses. And next slide, please. That's now sort of morphed into a series of international ISO standards that were launched primarily last year, that again are looking at how to integrate circularity into business models, measurement, etc. The product side of this is less evolved. However, there is now a circular design standard that has been developed within SEN, the European standards body, and I would expect from my that there might be something that will evolve at an ISO level at some stage in the future. So next slide, please. So there is a famous paper that I cannot remember the name of, in about 2018, that identified about 120 different definitions of circular economy, and trying to, yeah, well done, Trevor. And then we had many battles in the 180 countries as part of ISO to come up with a definition that sort of everybody signed up to. And this is a definition. One of the issues is over time, some, let's say, groups and even some countries have tried to define circular economy as a total new economic paradigm. But certainly our view is that circular economy fits within a broader sustainable development context. The other common point that gets confused, we found in particularly some of the distinctions, is people might be talk about transition towards circularity. One needs to separate out what one's talking about, from separating out how you integrate circularity into economies and societies, which is a huge macroeconomic issue, how you shift away from linear systems, versus how you bring circularity into organizations, processes, and products. So it's important to clarify what one's talking about and at what level. So even some of the standards are a bit mixed up in terms of the text on that at the moment. So this is part of an evolving agenda where even the vocabulary and the thinking is yet not fully grooved. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we chose in our work to use the 12 R's that had been developed by Jacqueline Kramer, who is the actually ex-industry person who became the Minister of Environment for the Netherlands and still very active in many areas in the Netherlands and a leading thinker. There are other approaches out there, but many of them are broadly the same, covering the same points. Again, I'm not going to go in great detail in this. You'll have more time to review this, and if you're interested, to follow it up. So next slide, please. So again, here we've articulated a bit more on the 12 R's, from the refuse aspects of this, which is more sort of consumption based, to sort of rethinking things, doing things in different ways, to more commonly understood terms, such as repair and refurbishment. However, there's still confusion in practice over many of these terms. For example, what's the difference between remanufacturing and refurbishment? And that's even confused within European legislation at the moment. And again, for example, in some of my projects, when I'm talking to people about reuse, they still use the term recycling. So really, we're looking at recycling as being really at the sort of end of the process, and much to do with the materials side, rather than how we retain the value of products, materials, and components in systems. So reuse, repair, refurbish is keeping that value in systems, and we're thinking about, from the design perspective, how you can sort of design that in. So next slide, please. So without further ado, I will now pass you across to Trevor for the key findings from the research and the project.
Thank you very much, Martin. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend about 20 minutes going through the three major parts of the work that we did. So I'm going to start off by looking at the national strategies. I'm then going to have a little look in the grey literature that's out there, publicly available on the web. And then I'm going to finish off with looking at the survey of practitioners that we ran. So just to echo slightly what Martin said about the scope, we've taken the widely used UK definition of the creative industries. Now, we do recognise that this does exclude a few things. So, for instance, kind of heritage libraries often included. Some countries include tourism, for instance, within their creative industries definition. And we also recognise that some people prefer the term cultural economy to the creative industries, but we're really talking about businesses here. Okay. So the entire work that we did is covered by this method here. I'm not going to cover the academic literature. You'll have to wait until our academic paper comes out for that, but I think you'll find that very interesting. And instead, I'm going to cover these last three elements. So first of all, we looked at these national strategies, and we were very fortunate that Chatham House have identified almost every single document that's been produced on the circular economy by governments worldwide. And what we did was we identified from their list a core set that seemed to be complete and up to date. And what I then did was to read every single one of them, translating them where necessary, and then pushing them through some text analytics to see if I could identify some of the key themes. So I think first thing I would say is 73 is an extraordinary number. And actually we have, pretty much every continent covered here. Some of the smaller nations, Moldova is the one I'll just pull out as an example, Rwanda, have written extremely good strategies by any standards. Now, it's not to say that they're fully implemented, but the documents are there and you can review them. So when you read these documents, I think what comes over very strongly is that they're really mostly still about waste streams. What most of these strategies do is they identify some priority industries, usually a manufacturing type industry, and then they really discuss some elements of eco-design, and more importantly, they talk about post-consumer waste, manufacturing waste, etc. And so in reality, there's only 4 that we identified that really talk about the creative industries as a sector. And I've just put those here on the slide. So for instance, the UK, where the creative industries is a priority strategy for our economy. First of all, we don't really have a very well developed circular economy strategy, and secondly, the creative industries aren't really part of it. When you look inside these documents, you do find actually there are some signs of the creative industries in there under the different headings. So product design, for instance, appears in over half of them, often as kind of an incentive for organizations to change, either voluntarily or through legislation, to adopt certain kind of circular design practices. Fashion and textiles, not surprisingly, does appear again in quite a large number, mostly because there's this implication about waste, less so on fashion design. And architecture, usually in the context of construction, appears in about 14 of them. A small number actually make a very explicit call for changes to design education, thinking more at university and college kind of level. You also get some mentions of media and advertising, but it's usually not really talking about changing the structure of that industry to make it more circular. It's really about using that industry to change the narrative from linear to circular for the general population. And probably one of the most important flaws, I think, in these documents at the moment, or gaps, is the lack of mentions of digitalization, the rise of data centers, for instance, for generative AI, which is so important in so many aspects of the creative industries, from filmmaking through fashion, etc. And there's very little mention of electronic waste from computing equipment associated with data centers and AI in this. And I think some of that is simply because these documents often started their first iteration maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, and they still haven't quite caught up with the technological change that's happening in the world. So that's an overview of the national strategies. If I look at these 12 R's across these different strategies, you won't be surprised, I suspect, to hear that waste and recycling words tend to come at the top. But also this whole idea of rethinking economies and supply chains. Back to what Martin was saying earlier, there is this macro level drive to shift people from linear to circular thinking and design processes. And that does come through quite well, I think, in some of the reports. Secondary markets, other kinds of business models tend to be also under this heading of rethinking. But when you start looking at the side that's particularly important in areas like, say, fast fashion, which is the balance between consumption and production, then I would say there's very little in these strategies around that kind of area. And you'll see that's also reflected in the grey literature analysis that we've done. So overall, creative industry is not really represented in these strategies. That will probably change over time. The strategies as a whole, really are about they're extensions of waste and recycling thinking that's been present for some time. So if I move to the grey literature, now, there are various definitions for grey literature, but this is essentially, reports that haven't necessarily been peer reviewed. It's things like web pages, handbooks, documents produced by people like BAFTA or the Theatre Green Book, you may well have heard of. These kind of guides that are out there, and it's also some of the more informed blogs and web pages out there. So again, we're seeing, if we look at the level of chatter, the level of discussion online, then about a fifth of it is really associated again with textile waste and fashion. Design, probably not too surprisingly, comes pretty high up too. Maybe more surprisingly, there's a lot of chatter around film, TV, performing arts, the visual arts and theatre. But again, I think there's this sense that areas such the high-tech kind of areas like Createch, those other areas that are using creative technologies like advertising and marketing, not quite so much online. And what's also very noticeable, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, is that although we found 54,000 items in our first search, by the time we'd taken most of the duplicates out, by the time we'd taken things that were overt advertising and promotion, actually there were only less than 5,000 items left between 2018 and 2024. So when you think of the size of the internet, it really says there's not a great deal being discussed yet about this topic. I just put a few examples of the sort of things that you can find in there. So mud jeans, I think, very well known. There's quite a lot of discussion about them. There's the Broadway Green Alliance, which is there for theatre. There are commercial businesses out there like Set Exchange, which is about repurposing, remanufacturing and sharing of sets between theatre, TV, dance, etc. There are kind of schemes like Albert with lots of guides around how you decarbonize and to a certain extent improve circularity in TV production and increasingly in film. There's quite a lot on festivals and events out there, stuff on dance, top left-hand corner. So it's a real mixture of things that are out there. And what you get a sense of is that there's a lot of kind of discussion and activity, but there isn't really a common design yet for the sector or even necessarily within subsectors. Getting a little bit more technical, if we look at the keywords in this grey literature related to the circular economy and the creative industries, so the 12 R's effectively, you can see there's a mapping here where the darker colours reflect a higher frequency of discussion in the literature. So how to interpret this is if you have a column, which is one of the 12 R's that has a lot of dark colours in it, then that column is clearly an area that's of interest in the creative industries. And I think what you can also see is that there are some columns here where actually there is very little being discussed. So repurpose, refurbish, remanufacture, and refuse are all very low occurrence within the data, along with recover. So although you do see variations between the different subsectors, I think you can already see that there aren't really 12 R's in the creative industries. There's probably only 9. And one of the reasons for that may be that there isn't really a lot of interest or applicability in some of these things like remanufacturing, or it could be that people don't really understand what they are or how they fit into their business models or business processes, or some mixture of all of the above. That's probably an area for future research. If I then look at our survey, where we now come down to talk to individual practitioners in the industry, I'm going to give you a caveat first. So yes, we managed to get 80 responses back to the survey. We did manage to get coverage from all subsectors, but 80% of the responses that came back were from the UK. So I think you need to kind of just accept that this is indicative or suggestive of what's going on within the sector. And although you could say that because the sector is rather large in the UK and relatively well developed, maybe it's a good indication for the rest of the world. I think that might be a step too far at this stage. But let me interpret what we do have. So the first thing is that you can see on the left-hand side that we got the largest number of responses from music, but a fairly decent set of responses from everybody else. And Martin and I have discovered that the whole live events and music area is generally very engaged with this topic of circularity. They will talk to you about it. They have their own WhatsApp groups and this kind of thing. So maybe that's not too surprising they come up at the top. If you look at the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that we've got a good mix between people who are creating productions, making films, making documentaries, designing garments, etc., and people who are supplying into the sector, whether it's physical products like cameras, for instance, for filmmakers, or packaging material for designers, whether it's people who are supplying information communication technology, like AI tools or blockchains, etc., or people who are supplying services into the industry like costume rental, etc. So I think we've got a fairly good mix here. So let me dive down into a couple of areas. So 90% of our responses were from very small businesses or freelancers, which I think is typical of the creative industries generally around the world. And I think if you look at the chart at the bottom, you can see that we haven't got too many kind of corporate type responses in here, which again I think is pretty typical of the structure of the industry. So how can we interpret their understanding, for instance, of the circular economy? So the first thing is, 36% said that they really didn't know very much about the circular economy, and very few, less than 50%, actually had any kind of training or external guidance. So we're talking about predominantly a freelance and small, medium-sized enterprise world where people are probably learning by Googling the topic. Maybe they listen to some podcasts, maybe they have some friends who tell them some stuff, but it's all relatively informal still. If you look at the spider diagram on the left, you can see as well, when we start asking people specifically about the areas that they do know, then mostly what people know about is recycling. So many of these other areas that Martin talked about, and I showed you earlier in the grey literature, are relatively unknown within the sector as a whole. And there are some subsector differences, but I'm not going to go into those just at the moment. Now, Martin and I have also used a maturity profile to try and understand the maturity of both the subsectors or the sector as a whole and individual organizations. And we call this ZBIA, so zero, basic, intermediate, and advanced. And again, in our survey, we asked people to self-assess where they thought they were and where they thought their sector was. And I think there's an interesting finding here, which is, first of all, most people think that they're relatively immature. They're either zero or basic. But when it came to people saying that they were close to zero knowledge. Not many people were willing to say that they were. And Martin and I are slightly skeptical about this because we've got some other sources of information that we can kind of correlate with this. And we think probably there's more people in the zero column here than are willing to admit it. But I think you should just take it at face value that we have quite a lot of people who are relatively low maturity. So small companies and freelancers, low maturity, narrow knowledge. This is clearly early stages for the circular economy in the creative industries. So what are the drivers? Where's the pressure coming to change? And is it going to change over time? So again, you get quite an interesting picture from the response. You can see that the artists and creators and makers are, kind of pretty important when it comes to driving this change. I mean, if you think in the music world, it's very easy to find people like Billie Eilish and Coldplay, these big performers, talking quite openly about sustainability in general, having quite a profound influence on, for instance, the way that contracts for appearances kind of appear. You can also see that kind of NGOs and activists are pretty influential here. But if you look towards the middle of the diagram and look to the future, I think you see quite an interesting kind of picture, which is there's an expectation that public opinion and government regulation is actually going to become a much more important driver for this sector. And most of this sector is relatively lightly regulated. There may be some exceptions. If you're a product designer in electronics, you've got a lot of regulations to look after. But if you're a theatre maker, or if you're a choreographer, or if you're a very small film production company, there's probably very little regulation when it comes to environment in particular that you have to pay attention to, and probably even less when it comes to things like resource efficiency or use of materials. So regulation seen as a driver in the future. That would seem to tie in with a lot of the trends that we see within the national policies and strategies. So this suggests that the industry will have to catch up in this particular area. So when we start thinking about regulation, I'd like to think about standards at the same time. So we asked people about some of those standards that Martin showed earlier. 3% said that they were using these standards at the moment. Now, the ISO 59000 series is very new. It's really 2024, but 8001's been around for quite a long time. We had about a third of people coming back and saying, yes, I've heard of these standards, but no, I'm not using them. And you actually had, I think, for me, one of the more surprising findings was a third of people actually said they didn't know about the kind of industry guidance that's out there. So there's, a lot of material produced by people like BAFTA, for instance, in the film world. Quite a few of the people from the film industry that responded to the survey said, never heard of any of this stuff. So there's clearly a communication kind of issue in there. And then if you look at the bar chart, you can see when you ask people, kind of who's prepared for regulations or actually implementing them, again, you get this picture that certainly in some subsectors, there's quite a lot of people who, about half of them, who are actually getting ready for changes in waste regulations as they apply to their subsector. But when we start looking at all of these other 7 areas here, then you can see that even though some of these things are highly discussed, like digital product passports and how they might affect many of the different subsectors, there's actually relatively few people, 10%, who are saying they're actually ready for it. So I'll close out with, kind of just a few pointers on transition. When we ask people about the kind of barriers that are in existence to transition, I would say right at the top comes cost. Rightly or wrongly, there is this perception that there is a significant cost associated with redesign, selection of different materials, all of the reverse logistics that might be involved. When you start thinking about someone like theatre or a dance company, There's storage costs associated with sets. There are skill issues to do with how you first of all design things that might need to be more modular, how you design them to be remanufactured or reused at some other stage. There's a real lack of infrastructure, like material reuse centres, and I could go on, but the people were able to list quite a lot of barriers. But they were also able to kind of point to what help they might need to make the transition. And I would say right at the top of the list are these two things. One is we need some skills, and we need the skills delivered in the right way in an industry that's predominantly micro businesses and freelancers. It's got to be short, modular learning. And we need to be included in policy. There is this reality, I think, that it's the creative industries as a whole are not particularly well embedded within policy making anywhere in the world. And where they are embedded, it tends to be the larger institutions, more on the cultural side, or large companies that are actually setting the pace rather than the freelancers, and there needs to be a way of dealing with that. So, overall picture, still got some way to go on national strategies. The grey literature really reveals a very active discussion, very diverse, fragmented discussion of cultural economy, people still finding their way, and the survey suggesting that we're still very much at the early stages. So, Martin, I'll hand back to you for the sector level implications. I think you might be on mute.
Classic. Thanks very much. And perhaps next slide, please. So really just reinforcing perhaps a number of the points that Trevor has made within the 70 plus circular economy strategies around the world. Creative industries are largely not represented as a sort of, let's say, as a holistic sector. You do get elements or subsectors involved or highlighted with programs, but there's a lack of a sort of targeted approaches. Also, they're probably, although we didn't look at this explicitly, if we look at countries that maybe have creative industries strategies, maybe they've got relatively little on circular economy. So it's still at an early stage, whichever way you cut this. So within England, within the UK, England is presently developing a circular economy strategy through a task force that will be launched in October. And the closest that one gets to the creative industries in that is that textiles and clothing is one of the 5 sectors that is going to be focused on. But despite creative industries, and I'm using UK as an example to illustrate here, despite actually at an industrial strategy level, creative industries being one of the 8 key sectors now as defined by government, again, it's not being explicitly discussed within the circular economy task force, to my knowledge. I think there's been some sort of mentions or discussion in the national strategies, maybe in Wales and Scotland, but not extensively, despite the interest of both countries in the sector as well. So there's a lack of policy, and this may be that opportunities are being missed from a sort of societal, cultural, but also perhaps on a business level as well. Next slide, please. So there is a need for perhaps more sector-specific frameworks. Most of what's come out through ISO so far for international standards organizations, or not mostly all of what has come out through ISO at the moment, has been horizontal and broad-based, i.e. covering all companies, all sectors. It's not sectorally focused. And similarly, the circular economy activity that may come under different names, but effectively is on circular economy or product circularity within SEN, has generally speaking been focused on energy related products, because that's where the drivers have been in terms of the legislation. One of the challenges that is now happening within a European perspective is the European Commission, effectively through the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation, has broadened out its activities around eco-design and circularity, and is effectively saying in the future they may well be product-based regulations in all products, all sectors. They're starting with fashion and clothing and iron and steel. So fashion and clothing as an end product and iron and steel as an intermediate product. But effectively, we're seeing there this attempt to look at specific sector-based stuff. But when we go back more broadly to look at creative industries, there really is a lack of tailored frameworks and indicators. Maybe one of the things that we found, for example, is this, which hasn't been really clearly documented in research to date, is there seems to be a sort of evolving interest and practice within theatres around circularity. There is an example of a specific so-called green book that's to be developed for that sector that has seems to have supported some of that, but that's not generally so in other sectors of the creative industries. And again, as highlighted by Trevor, there is much in terms of circularity. It's much less evolved. Next slide, please. Sign out and sign in again, or maybe if it's my end, maybe I should sign out.
Let me just stop sharing for a few seconds and then you seem to be getting some interference at your end, actually. Let me just...
Is it my end?
I think it might be you, actually.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but you're not moving at my end.
Just continue, and I will.
Yeah, just turn your video off for a second.
Webinar, isn't it?
Turn your video off for a second.
Okay.
Let's see if that makes a difference.
It's decided it doesn't want to turn my video.
Definitely sounds like it's your end. Normal service will be resumed shortly, folks. I think you're going to, when you start looking at what's happening, for instance, in film at the moment, you've got this whole rise of virtual production. You've got dramatic increases in energy consumption. because of the use of things like generative AI. There's a whole environmental cost associated with this. And that doesn't seem to be properly appreciated either by practitioners within the sector or indeed reflected in the national legislation. And so what is needed really, policies and frameworks that really address what Martin and I call this whole world that's behind the screen, that's generating, huge amounts of energy consumption, but also electronic waste, because there's a very short life cycle for things like servers in data centers. And also there's things like water use that's really, kind of growing, almost exponentially within the industry. I think, again, if you start looking more on the material side of the circular economy, that there's a lack of national, local infrastructures for things like repair or for sharing materials between different parts of the sector. For instance, a lot of costumes that get used in theatre can also be used in film, or they can be used in advertising shoots. But these things are not stored, there's no real tracking of them, so there's no digital asset management. And when you start looking at how procurement works, for instance, there's very little to help the buyers in this kind of sector, many of whom are very, as we said repeatedly, are freelancers and small businesses. There's very little to help them actually evaluate suppliers from a circularity point of view. So what you do see is a lack of circularity in the kind of briefs that are issued. And you certainly don't really see a lot of it in the kind of production schedules that are being produced. Again, I think if we were to kind of maybe think of a catchphrase for what we're seeing in the data, I would have to say it's high willingness, low support. So if you ask people across this sector, is the circular economy important today and in tomorrow and tomorrow, then the answer is most definitely yes. You can see the very high figure here, 86% expect this increasing focus in the next 5 years. But then at the same time, they'll offer you quite a lot of reasons why they're not doing something at the moment. And I think this is a kind of a real dilemma in the sector at the moment. And there's a lot of talk about business models, leasing, take-back models, particularly in things like fashion, but also in areas like equipment hire for film shoots. You see these kind of business models increasingly being adopted there. But at the same time, adoption does seem to be relatively slow. And I think the reason for that is many of the practitioners are not seeing the commercial benefits of this. And also that they're not really seeing any kind of viable ways of adopting these models. So often the people who are providing them finance don't really understand these models or don't like them, so they won't give them money to make the changes. They're often dealing in certain subsectors with clients who maybe have a particular way of doing business and they think this is too disruptive. So there's quite a lot of kind of work needed, both within the sector and also within those people that kind of finance the sector on aligning these business models and the kind of benefits, not just in terms of sustainability, but also in terms of financial sustainability. And then there's this whole area that you would think the sector would be incredibly strong at, which is this ability to tell very different kinds of stories about the circular economy and the way the world is going to change over the next few decades. But only half the people who respond to our survey said that they are actually getting circular economy themes into their content. And I think when you look at the national strategies, you can see that there's, again, a very patchy kind of response to this kind of area. Some people do have communications campaigns to shift citizen behavior, others do not. Some see it more as a market-driven thing. And I think when you start looking more at mainstream entertainment, by which I mean, kind of films and television, advertising, then, there's a lot of scope really to do more. I just give the example here. There's a lovely little family film called The Sea Beast. so animated film. That's got some of what Netflix referred to as green premise elements in them. And this is really using subtle visual and narrative cues to encourage people to question dominant linear narratives and start thinking about different relationships with materials, with nature, etc. So there's a lot more that can actually be done. And it's this sector that can do. So I'm just going to check and see if Martin's back online. Martin, are you back? Oh, I think we've really lost him. 2 seconds, folks. Just talk amongst yourselves. Oh, I think Martin's computer has heat stroke, apparently. So while we're waiting for Martin's computer and probably Martin himself to recover, I'll just finish off and then we'll open up for Q&A. So I think, if I just try and make it very simple, when I look at what we found and think about the maturity of the sector, which is quite low, I think there are 3 areas that companies in particular really need to think about. So the first thing is building some capability, and that could be very, very simple. It could just be make somebody responsible for the circular economy within the business, or if you're a freelancer, deciding that it's going to be 2 hours on a Friday afternoon that you're going to start thinking about this kind of stuff and start writing some stuff down. The second area is, for those particularly that are producing products, there are well-established circular design principles out there. Even where the product is not physical, it's a digital asset. Again, you can find lots of examples out there already of how you go about embracing circular design. So I think it's up to companies to just do that small bit of research to find those things and then apply them to what they're doing. And then finally, there are, lots of materials out there that people could use, biomaterials. There's even non-biomaterials that are more suited to a circular economy, say aluminium, for instance, which can be infinitely recycled. Think about the kind of production changes if you're in, say, fashion or in crafts, or, if you are, in the business of producing sets for theatre or for film. There's an awful lot you can do in terms of using recycled materials, thinking about reusing packaging or upcycling it, and of course cutting energy in things like film post-production processes. So what we did in our report is we put in a 100-day challenge for people and said, look, here's a tick list. If you can tick all of these things, then you're probably well on your way. So at that point, I'm going to stop. I'm going to ask people to come off mute if they would like to, and we're going to have some Q&A. Don't be shy. Feel free to ask questions.
Hi, Trevor. I can go ahead.
Thanks, Kurnak.
Yeah, lovely. So, this is obviously, we thank you for the presentation. There's a lot of interesting insights. I did want to ask you this very simple question around the recipe of, as we create these intellectual properties in terms of things that might need IP, etc. How are we trying to, bridge the gap between the global north and the global south?
Well, I think let me unpack that a bit. First of all, there's a we in there, and I'm not sure there is really a we at the moment. I think one of the things that, Martin and I observe in this is that the sector is very fragmented, both internationally and within different subsectors. And so you don't find necessarily these coalitions that are taking things forward on behalf of international kind of communities. Now, there are a few exceptions within that. Things in theatre, for instance, you can see that the people behind the Theatre Green Book have got kind of performing arts institutions pretty much all the way around the world, both north and south, working on circularity within theatre. But that, I think, is really a bit of an exception. If you look in film, you can see that Nollywood and Bollywood are not really that in alignment with what's happening in Hollywood or with European cinema when it comes to sustainability and circularity specifically. So I think there's a we problem still. And we see it a lot in the UK as well. Even within the UK, it's very difficult to point to who is actually talking on behalf of the creative industries. Sure, we have something called the Creative Industries Council, but are they promoting circular economy? Probably not that much at the moment. I think then when you look at North and South, if I look in, for instance, the academic literature, which is the area I've been looking at most recently for Martin, actually there's a lot going on within the creative industries in the global South. And I would say you can see, kind of in India, for instance, you can see how the frugal innovation mindset is informing a very different, kind of way of thinking about the circular economy compared to maybe how it's developed in, say, Northern Europe. So I think, I'm not sure there's much bridging going on, but I think there's circular economy stuff happening all the way around the world. And I would say there's equally interesting stuff happening in the global South as in, say, England. Martin, welcome back.
Yeah, it's a very weird, I think, UK problem now. There seems to be the heat seems to be impacting. So it's the second time this has happened to me, which has never happened before, is that I believe my computer crashed because it is getting to a certain critical heat. I had this with something else recently as well. So anyway, apologies. You've obviously kept going, which is great. What my only concern is whether it continued to record whilst you were talking.
I think it did, Martin, because I can see the counter still running.
Okay.
So I just to bring you up to speed, as you probably gathered, I kind of completed your section for you, and then we're into the Q&A. And Konak, start off with a question about the difference between global North, global South, 4 points West, and is there actually any bridging going on between those parts of the world?
An interesting finding that I'm asking to be clarified is from some recent research that was done looking at circularity across a range of different countries, and actually awareness and understanding, according to this study that Cambridge University was involved in with British Standards Institute, is India, it claimed to had a very high understanding of circularity. So, which I can sort of see it on one level because of some of the issues we've discussed, I'm sure. But it was significantly higher than in other countries. Now, I guess there is a, in a sense, waste is a resource in many countries, so people actually maximize the resource as long as possible. So certainly I've seen waste pickers in India. I know that there is active groups looking at repair, reuse, refurbishment across all sorts of areas in India, as an example of the global South. But actually, it was quite interesting to see such a high figure from a consumer point of view. So as I say, I'm asking for clarification of this from the completers, those who completed the survey. I don't know, Trevor, you had a look at that one as well, I think. Did you? Yeah.
Well, I was making the point that if you look in the academic literature as opposed to the grade literature and the survey, there's actually some very high quality kind of work coming out of India. I mean, there's a paper by Rao and Goswami, for instance, on the movie industry that's, really is as good as anything I have read. You've got a lot of stuff obviously on fashion coming out of industry, but also traditional crafts. There's a paper by Bardhan and Bhattacharya that's very articulate about the link between circularity, sustainable development, and community resilience. So there's I think India is clearly ploughing a very, very good furrow when it comes to circular economy in the creative industries. Outside of that, I can't really comment.
Yeah, I mean, we recently ran a circular economy workshop in Mumbai as part of a trip we had out there, and actually the where we covered variety of areas. The biggest area of interest seemed to be more in the community related issues like repair cafes and things like that. We didn't really get anything bubbling up, and actually on clothing and fashion, but we didn't set much bubbling on, outside of that at the moment. I see there's a question that's bubbled up.
Yeah, from Tina Lee. So for those that can't see the chat, the question is, how might we design circular economy initiatives that not only reduce waste, but also create meaningful economic opportunities for underrepresented communities?
So again, this isn't creative industries specific, but we have two projects that we're involved in that sort of have, so repair cafes is one where effectively there are over 3,500 of these in the world. So these are very much civil society, community driven, people bring in their broken products. And then there's a range of skilled volunteers that repair those products. And actually the average rate of repair is around 65% globally. So this is very much civil society driven. There's some element of this being, for the middle class, but there certainly is, other elements in other communities where people perhaps who couldn't afford to replace a product are bringing in their products to be repaired and therefore saving themselves money, as well as, reducing diversion to landfill and carbon emissions. Similarly, it's an entirely different area to creative industries, but we've just set up a reuse hub for cricket gear with the UK's largest recreational club. And part of the idea of that is for people to donate end of first life cricket gear and clothing, and then to redistribute that to state schools, to disadvantaged groups and individuals. So there are these sorts of initiatives emerging, but perhaps they haven't necessarily transferred across to the creative industry. In fact, there are some specific initiatives happening, I think, in clothing and textiles, particularly, and also within that, there are initiatives related more to the upcycling of clothing and textiles, so visible mending and things like that. So there are, initiatives emerging, but perhaps not explicitly in the creative industries. But
I think it's a problematic area, not so much because of the circular economy, but because of the nature of the industry. So if I look at film, which is probably the part of the industry I know best, it has an enormous representation issue, full stop. And that seems to be getting worse, actually, rather than better, from what I can see from various published papers. So I think the way to design circular economy initiatives that benefit these underrepresented communities is that you have to actually tackle the root cause of that underrepresentation in the subsector in the first place. I don't think there's necessarily anything inherent within the circular economy that's going to do that.
Sorry, in terms of my response, I realized I didn't precisely focus on the question, but actually rereading it again and hearing Trevor's response, certainly one of the things that we found, correct me if I'm wrong, Trevor, when we were doing the work more around Createch, was this issue we saw emerging from some of the createch and gaming companies is that they were looking to actually actively bring in people from underrepresented communities, and this
I
was
think
a
that was
big
particularly true in gaming. Yes.
yeah. So it's perhaps more generically it's bubbling up in some areas, but how it relates back to this specific area is probably not fully understood yet.
I think there's a nice research project in there for somebody actually to look at this one.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions?
Let me just have a quick look in the chat.
Or does anybody want to open their camera and ask a question? I think we're a small enough group that we won't shout over each other. So, or as we're a small group, if anybody wanted to make any comments on things that they heard that was particularly interesting, or they thought we missed, or, you know, I see Tina's got her visibility, you know, her camera up. So do you want to say something, Tina?
And remember to come off mute.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate the depth of the research and the thought that has gone in behind the information that you found. Thank you very much for sharing that. I find that one of the biggest barriers, and I'll echo what you have said before, one of the biggest barriers is cost of doing things, and also time to find ways to build a circular economy into your business. We run very lean. We don't have a lot of time for the projects that we have, let alone trying to figure out ways to make it more circular. I know that in our business we do reuse a lot of product. We do our best to do that, but I know that there is room for improvement. So, you know, having those 12 R's is really thoughtful, because it helps me think about ways that I could improve, not just on a personal level or a business level, but on a provincial and a federal level as well, because I'm from Canada. So it's just trying to figure out those ways that we can get people involved and not just not toss things away. There is a very toss away culture here because we have a lot of space, and we have unfortunately there is that mindset of, you know, once it's gone, it's gone. You know, I'm just going to toss it and it's going to go and I'm never going to see it again. So having this conversation is really important. So thank you very much for putting this on.
Tina, what industry are you in?
I'm in the nonprofit, but our focus is interactive digital media.
Yep.
So we do virtual production, gaming, like esports,
Yep.
but we are the workforce development and training side. So, you know, if somebody wants to get into the industry, we can teach you how to do that. Or if you're already in the industry and you're looking for ways to find funding, you know, we can, or build your business, we help you do that. So, you know, doing that, you know, that circular economy is an interesting way to think, because we run very lean because we are government funded. You know, trying to train and work as well as do all of this is a fine balance.
Yep.
And we're doing just like everybody. I'm not trying to make excuses. It is something that needs to get done. So thank you.
I mean,
sorry.
no, I was just wondering, are you in Vancouver? Or
No, I'm in the heart of
okay,
I'm in the
you're
heart
in
of
that
Canada.
You're in that valley area. That's the creative
Valley.
valley. You know, there was something we looked at something else. There was, yeah. No, I
think
can't
corridor.
remember.
Corridor. Is the word you
Yeah.
We're called the heart of Canada. We're I'm in Winnipeg, so we're in like right in the middle, and we're in the heart of Canada. So we are in an interesting. We're in a very progressive province, because we are constantly moving up like this. And Toronto and Vancouver are always like hockey stick, or they're like this. And so as everybody either looks up, Manitoba isn't always like looking as if we're moving, but when everybody else is down, Manitoba looks awesome. So we're a constant. We're a constant.
We were looking at within our work on the Createch sector. I know that we did identify a corridor, very generic, economic development marketing speak, if you like. But there was we'd identified some different parts of Canada that were actually, quite leading. And I know in the film and game sector that that particularly in Vancouver that there is a lot of activity. But again, going back to your sort of lean and mean type of thinking, this is where I also think that circularity, can play a role. But the issue we found, particularly on the standardization side, and other stuff I've been involved in, one of the gaps that's often missing is, where do I start? That's often the challenge for a lot of people, so I think this is where I think the sort of checklist at the end that Trevor mentioned, I can't remember what we called it, Trevor, but there was like a 100-day program or something that's very, very specific. So it's like, allocate, if you can, half a day a week to somebody. They then are responsible. Then they identify some of the key areas where perhaps improvements could be made, bringing people in. So not being too overly ambitious, but starting with some very practical, targeted initiatives. Because I think sometimes some organizations come with these overarching high-level goals, but unless it's launched effectively by leadership and it's embedded in processes, it either goes over people's head, or they prioritize, do I need to do that, or can I leave it to next year? So I think it's probably, particularly in smaller organizations, it's just starting off with very, very bite-sized practical things to start to build some level of activity, which will then lead to more knowledge, and then people starting to see opportunities, maybe.
No, very, very true. Thank you very much for those thoughts.
I did, if I may, I did want to ask you something to do with our current business model that we have. Our model is typically, one of the models that we have in the business is that we make things in the global south, which is the global model, and then it ends up in the global north, which is where, the unit economics works. But with circularity, one of the problems we face is, how do we close the end of life problem that we have, which is typically what circularity is about. So is there any sort of new business models that have come up in solving for the end of life as we move products across borders?
Across borders.
There's a whole literature out there. I mean, if you forget the environmental impact for a moment, there's a whole literature out there on tax efficient supply chains that addresses quite a few of these kind of issues. And a lot of it has grown up around, companies like Unilever, for instance, who very substantial presence in India, but also products used in lots of other parts of the world. So trying to work out, kind of how they handle both the first life of the product, but also how they handle the end of the life of the product, where they are in markets that they're required to do something about it. So that literature is a good place to go and look, and you can find lots of consultant reports on that kind of area as well. And then I think when it comes to kind of the physical element, particularly if you have some kind of level of extended responsibility, it's really, the answer seems to be local partnering. That seems to be the kind of business models that are out there.
So just building on what Trevor said, there's a huge amount of academic work around circular business models. A lot of it is very theoretical, and there's often quite a fundamental misunderstanding within, let's say, the academic community on the reality of this. Most companies will not change their business model unless there's a major opportunity or a major threat. So shifting towards an entirely circular business model is unrealistic for most companies, and it would take time, huge level of integration. So, you know, that shift and transition to a circular is tough, and it will take time, and a lot of companies won't want to do that. Why do we change our existing, if we've got a successful business model, why would we want to change it? Well, you might want to change it because your resource costs are going to go up, maybe they're regulatory changes. So it may be just going out and mining specifically in going into things like Google Scholar and things like that, with or using AI to skim the top of it, getting your prompts right specifically around the areas you're interested in. But effectively, it depends on what you're trying to, a bit more precisely what your question is in terms of the business models. So can you be a bit more specific with what
imagine,
you mean?
yeah. So let's take an example of any small business that does, let's say, 200 units. Let's take an example from Brazil. We're importing 500 textile-based products.
Yeah.
Small batch goes into the London retail, sort of in Mayfair region. And now it's come to an end of life at the customer's home, or the business wants to discard it.
Yeah.
Now, how do we close the loop at the very last end? It's not an enterprise problem. We're talking about, huge quantity. It's a small quantity, especially in the creative sector. So how do we solve the last bit?
Okay, so the last bit is the vast majority of exporters, as you've indicated, have no idea what happens to their products at the end of life. So that is the vast majority of companies. One of the things I've learned, very, very basic stuff from all my work in circular economy, most companies have no idea how the customer uses the product or how it disposes of the product outside of the very market research driven P&Gs and Unilevers and whatever. So because you've sold it into the chain, it's been sold on either through some online facility or through a store or some intermediary organization. So there's maybe some mechanism about developing some online tracking system somehow to identify that. Again, if you're setting up maybe some repair reuse operation where the end of first life, I don't know if you were using a conceptual idea or you had a specific type of product in mind, could you set up a mechanism whereby if that clothing or textile related product maybe got torn or ripped, maybe there's some authorized repairers that you used, that they took the product to, they repaired it, maybe for a fee or whatever, returned it to the customer. So again, it depends what you're doing. From some depth research we've done with 20 major companies, both SMEs and leading companies, who are already on the circularity business model level, we found the vast majority of companies, where they are at a product level, is they're thinking about how do we incorporate bio-based materials or recycled materials. Very few companies actually have that closed loop in place, other than if they have had to do that, particularly in electronics and automotive sector. The change that's happening in clothing and textiles is over the next few years, there will be so-called extended producer responsibility coming in. And we're running a whole webinar on another project. We're doing a lot of work on following the regulatory process in that area. So at the moment, I can absolutely see your dilemma. The issue is, if you're exporting to a UK, for example, you don't really want to get them to send it back to India to have it repaired and resent because you've got the additional carbon. The issue is then how you cost effectively set up either a collaboration or partnership to extend the first life of the items. Does that make some sort of sense?
Oh, 100%. And to be honest with you, and I live in London, and I have
Okay.
few friends who actually have had this very difficult tailor business model,
Yeah.
which just doesn't work in London area. I've seen
Yeah.
that time and again. I've got
Yeah.
a few people, they
What
just
you see
unit economics is very difficult.
Yeah, what you're seeing is now, and I forget the names of the companies, but there's a few emerging effectively that you've got a number of the big retailers see the legislation coming in, but they don't want to invest in setting up their own refurbishment facilities. So what you've started to see is a few specialist companies that will do that for the retailers. I think one's called United Repairers or something out of the Netherlands. So there are a few specialist organizations that are now being contracted with by large retailers to start to provide that service. So they're almost back office suppliers. They're doing that, A, because there's growing interest from consumers in that, and B, in my opinion, because they see the writing on the wall. More regulation coming in. They're going to need to have to understand how this works because there's going to be regulation coming in at the moment. But they don't want to be in the business of repair, if you see what I mean. So there are, I think Marks and Spencers have just announced collaboration with, I can't remember the name of the organizer, but there's a few specialist clothing repair operations emerging.
Yeah, and then there are the kind of more generic kind of platforms like TerraCycle, who operate pretty much around the world, and they will actually deal with very small batches, but they do expect some degree of local partnering to make that happen.
And then again, there are.
I think she's retired or she's on medical leave. So
might be time to mute Tina.
Yeah,
Tina.
Something really funny, just based on just my consumer experience. I mean, I went to IKEA the other day, and IKEA, I'm sure if you've seen that, they have a reuse recycle store at the end of checkout. I mean, it's ironic, but that is maybe less than one-tenth of the 1%.
I can't remember her name. It's been a while.
Of the
sorry.
Tina, I think you need to
mute. Yeah. So it's 1/10 of the 1% of the entire IKEA space. And I just had a small chat with these guys. I said, what do you guys do with this? Because a lot of these things don't move because people don't want to buy them. I think this is more of the greenwashing that we see that large companies are very good at. So if it doesn't move, it eventually ends up in landfill. Ideally, you would want to see at least starting off at least 1% of the retail space having a reshop space floor for products. IKEA products, especially in highly dense countries like the UK and cities like London, we can easily have these things go back into the store and people can buy it. But like you guys said, it's not the model of these big companies, basically.
Yeah, I know that they have been strategically looking more at repair and reuse specialist operations. How far they've got into implementing this within their shareholder-driven models is another question. If again you're looking at even providing at a level of providing advice to people about the extension as a sort of added value point, of course, and it is very vague, and we're looking at this separately, the between 400 and 700 UK repair cafes, probably 60% of them have clothing textile repair stations in this. So it is one of the product areas where there's a lot of activity happening at the moment. But, and I think we did touch on it a little bit, a lot of these repair reuse infrastructure, whether it's repair cafes or other areas, is very vulnerable. A lot of them are often run by social enterprises or charities. One of the areas that we've been looking at and are working on, and if you're based in London, you might be interested in that, is we've set up this reuse hub for cricket gear in Spencer, in Earlsfield, in Wandsworth, working with Decathlon. And So effectively, what they're looking to do as a sort of largest recreational cricket club in the country is they see this value of collecting, acting as a hub for cricket gear that's distributed to them, that's maybe stored in the attic, stored in the garage, stored in the back of the club. And essentially, by providing a hub, a space, then they can redistribute this to state schools where there are gaps that help. Maybe they'll identify some players and some talent. Maybe they redistribute it to disadvantage, maybe Afghan refugees or Sri Lankan refugees. So, but my point there is for cricket, for the whole country, just as an example of one specific area, there's only about 6 reuse operations, and the largest operation that was based in Ipswich, that run by the Lord's Taverners, a large charity, which was national. They've just closed it down. So
yeah, it's back to this. But I mean,
vulnerability.
And again, just kind of bring you back to the creative industries more generally. I mean, I think there is this issue that the infrastructure is either not there, or it's fragile, or it's highly fragmented. Martin, I think time is up.
Yeah, indeed. So thank you very much, and I much apologize for my blowing up of my computer. I need to make sure, I think now, whilst it's still hot in the UK, I do not run webinars in my very hot kitchen. Very good for the winter, but not for the summer, in our freak weather occurrence, which may not be, this may be climate change and more than the new norm. But anyway, apologies for that. I hope that it kept the recording going. But hopefully, thanks very much for Trevor for keeping the everything running and your engagement in this. And I hope everybody got at least one thing that was useful from it, maybe one action, one thought. But it is an area I think we'll be looking to do more continue our work in. So keep watching this space, and then we'll be distributing other stuff. Again, for any of you who are interested in the clothing and fashion side and related to some of the things we were just talking about, we're also part of a 3-year project where we'll be disseminating a lot more information around this area, and that's free to open to anybody in the world. So you don't just have to be in Europe for that. So so anyway, thanks very much all, and have a good rest of the afternoon, and keep your computers cool.
Yes, indeed. And yourselves, of course.
yeah,
Take care.
indeed.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you for everything.
Bye.